Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Found Friday. Joining me, I've got, as usual, Ray, the founder and CEO of Ginza Metrics, and myself, Erin. You can send us questions, comments, criticisms, hopefully not as many of those, on Twitter Live during the show using the hashtag FoundFriday. You can also check out the Ginza Metrics blog where we post a recap of the show as well as the recorded video afterwards, and that's ginzametrics.com/blog. So we're going to kick today off as kind of a continuation from a conversation we were having on the last episode of Found Friday. And it's really around the importance of UX and UI from a search and marketing strategy perspective, and really about kind of why this is so important, right? So typically the show really does deal with a lot more traditional SEO, content marketing type issues, and so a lot of people may say, you know, what's going on with this conversation? One, it's because it's what Ray and I want to talk about, and when you do 100 of these, eventually you do what you want to do. And second, it's because, you know, really what's the point of driving traffic and getting found by your target audience if they don't stick around and use your product later, right? So there's a lot of other kind of nuanced issues, but that's one of the big ones. So if you're going to spend all this time and money driving traffic, like, let's make sure that they hang out. And, you know, Ray and I kind of encounter these problems all the time with our own product, and so we figured we're not the only ones out there struggling with this, because there are tons of blogs and materials dedicated to exactly you know, this conversation. So Ray, like, let's start off kind of talking a little bit about how do you know when it's time? Like, how do you know that you have a UI and a UX issue? Like, how do you know that this is even a thing and that you could be doing better?
It's a really good question. I think that, you know, it's funny because we spend so much time with our product in the way that we promote it as a solution. It's a very top of the funnel solution, but what we're talking about now is something that's further down the funnel, where they're interested in what you're selling, they're engaged potentially with your content, and the question is, what is it that is going to take them to convert and take that next step to activation and ideally long-term retention, everything else. And it's actually a harder problem than you would think on the surface of it to identify, like, when this is actually an issue, because there are many potential reasons that someone would not necessarily activate or become, you know, a customer. It could be UI, UX related. It could be something completely different. You know, it could be timing issues, their own budget, and it's one of those things that, you know, people have attempted to solve through various angles, like, you know, conversion optimization, landing page optimization, and even lead scoring. You know, so some people have said, well, maybe the people who are involved in your funnel now are not even the right people to be there, and it's a qualification problem. And so there's lots of different angles. Starting to narrow down the UI UX problem is I think probably half science, half art, because it's hard to find the data to say the reason that people are not doing what you want them to do in sophisticated SaaS products is specifically because of UX issues. I think with simpler products, it's a lot easier, because you can point to, you know, A/B tests and say, hey, we made these changes and these people activated, and that's something obviously that certainly works. But when you start talking about holistically, when you're selling to a company versus an individual, it becomes a much more difficult problem. So go ahead.
I was going to say, do you think it's almost like a process of elimination game sometimes for people, where it's like you've got this list of potential things that could be, so where you started out with is exactly where we always start the conversation, right? Which is when somebody takes certain steps and then decides not to purchase, right? Specifically in the example of, you know, having a free trial where they get the opportunity to come in and play with something for a while first, is this idea that they've come to your site, or they've come across your content, they enjoyed your content, explored a little more, signed up for a demo, attended that, liked that, went to the step of engaging with a trial. Then there's like this list of, okay, they didn't end up moving on to the next step. What's the potential list of reasons? And say there's 10 different things, everything from like budget to timing, you know, to whatever, and then like UI and UX are at the bottom. And I think one of the things that we have a really tough time with, and I know you and I go back and forth about this, and luckily we're friends, or I think we'd kill each other, is this idea that the other problems are always easier to fix, right? Like
Yep.
let's change the
Classic.
pricing.
Yep.
Let's update let's update the text on the web page. Let's make more educational materials. Like let's do all these things, right? But like the crux of the situation that like is my usual sticking point is yes, it's definitely really hard to make changes to the product itself. But over the long haul, I think it's more expensive to keep redoing all the other things.
Yep.
Especially because the other things aren't really going to create lasting relationships. It may create a quick conversion, but it won't create a long-term customer. Now, the converse side of that we'll get into as well later is which changes do you make, right? Like sometimes you've got a problem, but it's really about pinpointing and narrowing that problem down. Um, so there's a lot more to that, right? So let's talk about beyond knowing when it's time, because there's that issue, right? Like that there's a problem. You can either do this like I'm just going to tick everything off the list and check it, and then if I'm still having conversion problems, fine, I'll look at the UX. You can do it whatever way you want. At some point, people probably know that there's a problem. Um, let's talk a little bit about like how do you actually fit it into your roadmap, right? Because this is one of our big things. We have limited resources. Technically, everybody has limited resources to some
Right.
degree because you just can't hire everyone. Um,
Yep.
when we're talking about this, it's a choice of do we make new product features or do we invest in updating the current ones? If we do invest in updating the current ones, how long do we spend
Yep.
doing that? Like there's all these different things, right? So when you're thinking through it, what goes through your mind? What are you weighing?
I think for me, it's I always go back to the conversations that I have with customers, potential customers, and so that is always the trade-off. There is I think if I were to come down on an extreme viewpoint, I would say I would rather focus on making my existing customers happy and keeping them happy versus worrying about continuing to expand out. And I don't know if that's necessarily the right viewpoint. I mean, obviously we want to keep our customers happy, and I know this is something that product managers always, debate everywhere. But um, I think one of the things that left a big impression on me when I went through Y Combinator early on was a statement by Paul Buchheit, the guy who invented Gmail, and he said it's better to have it's something like it's a million just kind of like moderately happy users or just kind of so-so users. And the point was that if you continue to focus in on the product and make it useful for that core group of people, it may take a long time, but eventually they're going to start promoting it to other people, and it'll start to grow naturally. Granted, that was coming from more of a consumer product perspective, and so I think that B2B SaaS, especially at the enterprise scale, is somewhat of a different proposition. But um, I think nonetheless that kind of left a big impression on me. So I'm always very concerned about making sure we're meeting the needs of the people who are already our customers. I would say the next kind of tier beyond that would be what am I hearing in sales conversations when I talk to people. So I'm talking to people, I hear what they tell me what they're looking for, and a lot of times obviously we'll have what they need and it's a good solution for them. And then there are times where they're looking for something else, and at that point we have to decide, is what they're looking for something that we want to build, or is it something that's just a completely different solution? Is it a feature parity issue potentially with where the market is going or should be going or already is, or is it just something that's not in our particular area of expertise and we shouldn't really focus on it? So those are always kind of the questions that run through my mind from a pure feature construction perspective. And then interestingly enough, I think that I know we fall down on this side of things quite often. I'm not sure if this is something that's true for a lot of other companies, but we try to make our onboarding process easy. But one of the things that we're realizing is that we do have a pretty sophisticated product, and we're moving more towards um, trying to get involved in conversations with people early on versus just expecting them to self-activate. And I think that's one of those things that you see kind of quite clearly delineated in SaaS, in the sense that if your SaaS product is like a base camp type product where you're selling to probably an individual with purchasing power and a credit card ready to go, I think that self-activation and trial makes a lot of sense because that's the only person you're trying to convince. But when you're starting to deal with higher ticket item SaaS products like ours, and certainly there are more expensive products out there too, you're not just selling to one person anymore, and they're not just going to throw their credit card in there. You need to understand what all the different dynamics are, what the timing is, And so from that perspective, it's, as we've kind of popped our head up and looked around, we've noticed that there are very few enterprise SaaS companies that offer free trials directly from their website. It's more they're basically forcing you into that conversation. And so gross, why don't you just let me try it out for myself and see if it works? But the reality is that it doesn't really work in many cases. And so I think that that's one of the other things that you have to understand about yourself as a company is who you're selling to, what's the sales process like, because that's going to have a really big impact on overall activation and retention.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot to be said for kind of the free trial, like explaining thing, and it does pain me a lot to think that we have a product that's not so super intuitive that we have to talk someone through it and that they have to get onboarded. And as much as I hate that, you're right, but like it's a complicated thing, right? Like, and because it's trying to address the needs of an entire ecosystem, right? Like it's not just ranking keywords. It's doing so much more than that, and it is a platform that one of the things that I know that we're really focusing on is understanding what it is that someone's use case is, and then specifically when we get on the phone with them, walking them through that use case, saying, so what you really want to understand is competitor intelligence. Okay, we're going to show you how to use the platform to accomplish competitor intelligence. And then at least, even if they're not getting like the full scale, everything that we could do from soup to nuts on it, they're getting at least the part that they identified. And so when they're in the product, they can kind of expand their knowledge. Once they get this one workflow down and start seeing results from that, we can kind of continue to expand. And it's taken a long time for me to think that that's like a good thing, or that's okay. I'm like, yeah, but they've got, like they're paying for this whole thing. Like, let's make them use it. But really, it's a good point, the internet purist thing, saying that people should just be able to get in there and have a free trial, and I felt that way for a long time too. But if you really look at anything that costs a lot of money and has a lot of stuff going on, you have to talk to someone, right? So like look at the automotive industry. There's not just 50 cars sitting on the corner of my street with the keys to them being like, why don't you go drive this around for a while and then come back and be like, hey, like I like this one. You have to talk to someone. Like they need to know, one, that like you're qualified to even purchase the car before they hand you the keys. And that's a big thing that we do, right? Like we can't have people in the system for 2 weeks or a month or however long for free using data, because that's a cost to us. Same thing that you wouldn't just like take a BMW out to drive, run, $100, worth of gas through the thing and like play with all the buttons and poke stuff and have a Big Mac in the front seat and then return it and be like, I don't make enough money to buy this anyway, but this was fun, thanks. So yeah, I mean, I do think that, when you're talking about spending significant cash on something, there should be an expectation of having to speak to someone, having to show that like you're going to be invested in trying to use the tool, that we want to be invested in making you successful with the tool, and then showing you how to operate it at its maximum performance, the same way that somebody at a high-end car dealership would show you how to make sure that you're using the car to its maximum performance. Like, don't put regular gas in this; it needs premium, or whatever. So yeah, I don't know. There's definitely a lot to that. Let's talk a little bit about responsibility to the users when you make UI changes, or like you were saying, we spend a lot of time focused on making our current customers happy. And I know that comes at cost sometimes, although I'd like to think that if what we're doing is making a product that makes our current users really happy, that beyond just getting recommendations, which I would love, is that somebody else would also want the same things that these people want, right? So like by serving our current clients well, we should be serving the needs of a greater audience, because a lot of people have similar problems. So I don't ever look at it as a waste. Although we do weigh features based on whether or not we think anybody would ever want them, or if it's like a one-off thing, because that's definitely
we're not just going to build anything. Exactly.
Well, you can't, because everybody wants something, right? Like, what if I just said I just wanted it to be pink just because I like it, and you're like, well, nobody else wants it to be pink. So let's talk a little bit about responsibility to users, like when you make changes. When we did our dashboard big update last year, we spent time telling people that that was coming so that they wouldn't log in the next morning and be horrifically shocked, right?
Yep.
So you do have to tell people. I think that there's also some sort of give and take to where if what you're doing is technically making things simpler, hopefully
Right.
what you're doing doesn't require a 50-page instruction manual that kind of lays out all the changes unless you have like basically hidden some stuff that people use a lot.
Yep.
Um, so what do you think, and how did you feel last year when we went through, because I was in the marketing thick of it at the time, but like how did you feel when we updated the entire dashboard and what you heard back from people?
Um, I think what was going through my mind was probably a couple of different conversations. One was a sense of relief because our old dashboard was so bad, so I couldn't wait to get the new one released. The second one was certainly around making sure people understood what the changes were. Um, I think I probably worried about that more in our Japanese market than I did in the U.S. market because I guess I kind of probably assume rightly or wrongly that American customers are just going to kind of roll with it. But in Japan, everything is very measured in the way you have to roll things out, and so um, even very small changes have to be given notification to people. You can't just change things around on them. And so that was one of the concerns that I had. But I think overall, I think whenever we build a new feature, we want to make sure it's actually going to be used. So as we were redesigning things, we were basically constantly thinking about, well, how is this going to be used? What's going to be the most, relevant way of presenting this information? How can this help people in their day-to-day workflow? So that's kind of what's always going through my mind when we design new features. And I think that's just one of those things that you just kind of have to practice over a long period of time. You can't really be good at it on day one.
Well, so here's an example of a common complaint that you and I have all the time, and I've heard other people voice it as well. But every time we get ready to go do this show, the UI to Google Hangouts has been changed.
Yep, totally.
And I can tell you that is such a frustrating experience because it doesn't feel like it's necessarily an improvement. It feels like I'm a guinea pig, right?
Yep.
And to be honest and fair, Google is providing a free service for us to use so that they actually can use us as guinea pigs, right?
Yep.
It's like, we're going to give you this for free and we're going to try some stuff out on you. So you do have that trade. I think
Totally.
that because we're an enterprise platform and people are paying for our service, we do have a responsibility to educate them and to not make changes unless we've really carefully considered the impact on people's day-to-day lives.
Yep.
And I know that one of the options that we give people, if they have a really big problem with it, is like we can configure your dashboard back to something more usable again,
Yeah.
or like something that fits your workflow. If you're like, I absolutely hate this, like we can switch them back. And I know, it is interesting, the international aspect of it, beyond just differences in preference and education.
Yep.
When you make these big changes, you also realize that like not everything translates smoothly from one
Yep.
to another. And
Yep.
so there's that whole aspect of it too, right? So like this changing of somebody's like UI, UX workflow situation on the customer side requires educating everybody in your organization about what's going on with that, and then helping them learn how to educate the customers, making sure it'll still fit with whatever that particular scenario is. And I mean, it's a huge thing, which is why super large companies have entire localization teams dedicated to exactly this.
Totally. Yeah. No. Totally.
So now let's talk a little bit about like if somebody really wants to. So we started off talking like a little bit about resources, and we went into more about how we decide what stuff to do. When you have to make this choice about whether or not we're going to build something else, and if we are, and what the potential impact is going to be, and we talk about this a lot, is whether it involves using existing engineering resources and having them stop working on something
Yep.
new that they were building, like a new feature to change around kind of an existing workflow. Um, that's a cost, right? Because like it's money that we're paying that we could have paid them to do something different, right? So everything, like the time that we spend doing this show, right? Like this costs us money because this is time that you and I aren't doing something else.
Yep.
Um, and then there also is like, that drain of somebody has to spec it out. So let's talk about how, from a small company perspective, right? Like allocating budget to doing things like this kind of comes down, right? Because like you've been through a couple of iterations of the product since you started it, and we're building some more stuff now. So like obviously these are things that weigh on your mind, and we don't change stuff all the time. Like we don't change the UI very often, and
Yep.
obviously that's a budgetary consideration.
Yep. Yeah, it's actually a really interesting question, and this is probably where things start to lead into like the UI UX question as well, where um, if I guess my question is always, if we're going to change something, in the dashboard, we obviously want to do it in such a way that we can objectively say it's an improvement. And there are different levels to that. There's like changes to the visual design, which may be the way we handle table rendering, or the icons that we use, or the text font that we use, the size that we use. All those things obviously have an impact on the overall visual design. Um, and then there's the actual UX, which is this idea of how does the actual application actually work, on pretty much every screen. And I think that we always know as product designers that there's ways to improve the UX, and the UI, the visual design. But I think the UX is one of those things that we probably spend a lot of time thinking about. And we've had this conversation of neither of us are UX experts. I think we've built a decent product, but we're certainly not experts in the field. And the long standing question in my mind. I actually wrote a blog post about this like 3 years ago, and it still really hasn't been resolved in my mind. It has been, when you hire a UX expert to come in, whether they're a full-time employee or an outside consultant, I think the challenge that you're going to deal with almost immediately is when you're building a sophisticated product like this that's very data and visualization heavy, is um, they will be very good at designing good human interactions, and it can help you understand the way people are going to use your product. But um, I always seem to have a hard time understanding how they're going to grasp what the product does without a deep level of expertise and understanding. So they may come in and say, hey, we need to do these 5 things because it's going to make it so much more usable and so much easier for people to understand. But the designs they put together basically have very little basis in reality, in terms of what's capable on the back end engineering side, the way the data works, the way it fits together. And so it's like, in many cases, it's like going out to one of these free bootstrap themes that are out there on the website, on the web, or out on other sites that offer these like skinnable admin templates where they look beautiful, they have lots of cool looking charts and visualizations and dashboards that you can drag around and everything. But that inevitably becomes like a back to the visual design side of things, and it doesn't really necessarily match with what the product is. And so that's the thing I always try to resolve in my mind, and I haven't come up with a good solution for it yet. Maybe I just haven't met the right UX person that's able to come in and do something like that. It may be one of the reasons why really fully staffed product teams at companies like Square and so forth probably spend so much on hiring UX people, just because it's one of the core things that really matters in a consumer environment, where in a enterprise SaaS environment, probably at least you can get away with having conversations around helping people understand it better. That being said, we get pretty good feedback on our product, but I know there's always room for improvement. And I think that you and I are really trying to figure out like what's the next level of this, so we can make it even easier to use, and really improve things. So it's a really relevant topic for us.
Yeah, I mean, as weird as it is, and I mean, I don't mean this in a disparaging way, because, like you said, we both feel that there are improvements we could make to our own product. But there are products that are out there with a lot of customers charging a lot of money, making a lot of money, that I think are really hideous,
Yeah.
and just horribly ugly. And so at the end of the day, from an enterprise side of things, there's more importance, I think, placed on the data itself and the intelligence that you get than necessarily the fancy visual acuity, right? But that said, the importance of having the right UX UI situation going on, and why people do want to put this money in there, is the data is only important if you can find it, right? So, or if it's like displayed in a way that somebody can actually get something from it. So, we talk about that a lot, is, there's a difference between, like you said, changing fonts and colors and things like that, making something maybe look visually prettier. But what I think you and I always come back to is this actually going to help somebody get the information they need? And that's where I think I would rather always like kind of allocate budget and spend money.
Yeah.
There's so much to having conversations with users around like what it is that they're doing. And I think one of the things that's easy to forget is that once you have trained users that have been around for a long time and they train other people on their team, they've almost gone a little native, right? Like they're used to the product being the way that the product is. And so they sometimes will stop giving you the great feedback that you need because they have learned to do things your way. And it's part of why a lot of people have this cost to quit association, which is specifically on like the agency side and things.
Yeah.
When you have teams and teams of people, and a lot of these users are like cycling in and out, because agency turnover is really high, and clients have stuff that they like and are used to using. Quitting doesn't just mean having to move your data somewhere else or having to pay for something else. It means having to train people that have become ingrained in a system in how to do something else. And even if the other thing is easier, it's not easier to them because it's what they're used to, right? Like they get Stockholm syndrome. It's like Salesforce. I swear everybody that uses Salesforce has Stockholm syndrome because there's no other reason. It's just so horrible. I bash them a lot during the show. I'm really sorry.
Because it could be so much more. The product could be so much better if you think about what it does and all the integrations it has. It's there's no reason that it couldn't. I mean, there's a reason that already because of the platform capabilities that it has that it's the number one CRM SaaS platform out there. But if you think about what it could be, it could actually be a really enjoyable experience that everyone loves telling each other about.
I don't care that it's ugly. I care that it's hard to use. Like that's the thing. I feel like people think I'm bashing it because it's ugly. Like, yes, it is ugly, but it's also just impossible to freaking use.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
And I mean, and I realize like some of that is on me, right? I don't spend a ton of time getting trained on it, but I've had to use it a number of times in my career, and I can tell you every single time I do, and I'm not.
No, it just makes me feel bad as a human. Yeah. I mean, it's one of those. I mean, companies will spend tens of thousands of dollars just setting up their Salesforce environment. It's like it needs an entire other layer of consulting just to make it run.
I mean, and there are consulting firms that make tons of money off of getting people set up on Salesforce because Salesforce themselves actually refers you to a local Salesforce consultant.
Yeah.
And so I think it's interesting that when you, like, if there were people who literally just taught people how to use our product, I would be horrified.
Yeah.
Like, mortified beyond belief that was necessary. I mean, so beyond this, like, UI, UX thing, and maybe this is a conversation for our next show, goes into how do you know if you are going to do this thing where it's like everybody has to do a demo, you have to speak to us, we have to help onboard you. How do you know as a smaller company and even as a larger company at scale when it's right to hire, not just sales, but then like inside sales and like account management and customer support? And in today's kind of outreach thing, there's all these different layers, right? So there's community managers who manage communities and have all these different conversations with people. There's support people who sometimes will handle every kind of issue and sometimes more technical. And then there's account managers who will not only help get you onboarded, deal with your day-to-day problems, talk to your team members, will also upsell you, explain new features, will be the point of contact if somebody does make a UI, UX change. So I think that not just for smaller companies, but at mid to large size organizations as well, how do you know what the right proportions are, right? Like, is it a one-to-one, like everybody gets an account manager if you're a huge customer? So say somebody was going to pay us $10 million, like, sure, you can totally have a dedicated account manager. But for most people, somebody's managing 20, 30, 40 accounts, right? So how do you know when it's
Yep.
time to make those hires? So I think that maybe that's a good place to jump off for this week, and
Yep.
we can pick up next week with kind of a little bit more about that.
Sounds like a plan.
Awesome. Happy Friday, Ray.
All right. You too.